You're listening to the Columbia HXA podcast. I'm Clayton Smith.
And I'm Anthony Rispo.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Columbia HXA podcast. I'm Clayton Smith, and as usual, I'm joined by Anthony Rispo. Say hi, Anthony.
Hey, everyone.
We are super excited to bring you a very special guest today, who is our one of the faculty co-chairs for the Columbia HXA community. And that is Joe Terwilliger. Did I say that right, Joe? Because Terwilliger.
You almost got it.
I almost got it. It's a hard G.
I've only known him for a year.
Yeah. How long does it take for someone to get it right? Because I've heard several interviews of you with you, and people stumble.
It all depends on. I mean, usually it's not a problem. But
Yeah.
Well,
it's not so unusual.
In a way, I do kind of blame you, Joe, because you're the one with the difficult to pronounce last name. Not everyone can be like me and have the easiest last name in the Anglophone world.
Wow. But mine's phonetic, so.
It is. That's true. Just a lot of syllables. But
it's only really hard if you're Asian.
Oh, really?
The R, the W, and the L's.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you would know something about.
That's why I had Chinese name in my Chinese class, because my teacher couldn't pronounce it.
Wait, what was it? Your Chinese name? Wait, say that again.
Dodo, wait.
Oh.
Okay, I'm not even gonna try. In any case, let's quickly get through this introduction before we get into it. So it is in fact pronounced Terwilliger with a G, hard G. And Joe, you are
like Sideshow Bob, from The Simpsons.
Like Sideshow Bob from the. I love the Simpsons reference. That's
Sideshow
great.
Bob Terwilliger.
Oh, actually, you know what? I hadn't seen that show in so long. I didn't realize that was his last name as well. I was going to ask
you. It changes everything. It changes everything.
Okay.
Completely changes it. Yeah.
But just in case anyone listening doesn't know, and a lot of our listeners are a part of the HXA community, so I'm sure many of them actually know you personally, but what is your affiliation with Columbia? You are a professor of genetics, is that correct?
Technically, I'm called professor of neurobiology, but I don't know anything about neurobiology. My appointment is in the Department of Psychiatry because 30 years ago, when I got appointed, people thought psychiatry and genetics would be useful in psychiatry. But now everybody knows it's not. Well, some still pretend it is, but it's not. Therefore, everyone in the psychiatry department, I can't be a professor of psychiatry because I'm not an MD. So they call us professors of neurobiology, even though I know nothing about neurobiology. But I also joke that it's the one thing I have in common with everyone else in my department is that I don't know anything about psychiatry either.
Wow, what a maze. Oh my gosh, that's something.
Like such a quirk of like, what is it? University bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Well, in Columbia, they teach Finnish in the Department of Germanic Languages. So that's, it's not at all Germanic,
It's not. It's part of the language group. The mountain range.
It's more
Uralic.
It's more similar to like Korean than it is to German. So
right. It's the pre Indo-European languages, the Uralic languages, right? Like is it Estonians like that as well?
They all argue about that. Nobody really knows, and they can't agree about what language families are because they evolve so fast. But all I can tell you is Finnish, and all my notes when I studied Finnish were in Korean because it was so much more similar to Korean than to English.
That's so fascinating. So I guess I didn't realize that there was like that much debate still with the kind of non-Indo-European languages. Like I had always read that like Hungarian and Finnish and Estonian were all part of the. I mean, they're certainly more related to each other.
Somewhat similar. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but you're saying like Korean is more similar to Finnish than
German.
Than German. Yeah, yeah.
That's all I meant. It's like the structure is fairly similar.
That's fascinating. Because Korean's something of a language isolate, is it not? I mean, there's not a lot of other language.
Similar. It's very similar to Japanese also.
Is it? Okay, again, I guess I know so little on this topic.
I know basically nothing about this at all.
So it is quite similar to Japanese.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So let's backtrack here for the sake of our listeners. Why don't you tell us, Joe, because I think a lot of people will be surprised, just how many languages would you consider yourself fluent in?
English. That's it.
No, okay, so you don't consider yourself
fluency. I don't think you're ever. It's hard to be fluent in a language unless you're using it every day, living there, and all that.
Yeah.
But I mean,
yeah.
I can get by in several.
So what are the ones you think the handful that you are the best at getting by at with?
I think Chinese, Korean, Finnish, French is pretty easy. I with Russian I can get by when I'm there. I can read at least and talk to people and that
So
sort of stuff.
would you consider yourself something of a polyglot?
Sure. I guess, yeah. I keep trying to learn more, and I've been studying Greenlandic during lockdown, so
just as you do.
Like you do.
Just you do.
I have a project in the Arctic, so and I've always liked the Arctic.
As you do, also.
Cool language,
right.
Everyone spends time in the Arctic and then gets the itch to study Greenlandic.
Well, if you study genetics, if you want to do actual genetics research,
that makes sense, of course.
You can't really do it in New York, although some people try, but it doesn't really work because we're all different for things that have nothing to do with what trait I'm interested in. We're different because of history. And so there's a lot of noise and not enough signal. So we go to places where there's less genetic variation, because in those places, you can see what makes people different from each other more easily.
Right. Yeah, right.
So that's
homogeneity, right? You have more.
Right. So I think this is a good place to kind of get on track with one of the things we wanted to talk about here, and that is the research that you do at Columbia. I guess just generally is obviously in genetics. So what have you traditionally studied? What has been your interests?
Well, I mean, when I was a student, my degree was I basically studied statistical analysis in genetics, where it was how to analyze data to help people find genes affecting certain traits, or to compare, different populations and look at ethnic variation. What happened is people kept coming to me with data and saying, how can I find here, can you analyze the data and help me find the gene? And I said, well, no, because you collected the wrong data. And with that data, you're not going to be able to find anything. And my frustration was that everybody wanted to collect data in their clinic or wherever they had easy access to it. And that doesn't really work very well in genetics, because especially in a city that's as heterogeneous as New York, you're comparing apples and oranges, and it's just a big mess. So I kept encouraging people to study more isolated populations. So when I was still a student, even my advisor was working with people from Finland, and Finland was a great place to do genetic research on rare diseases, because Finland's a fairly small population. Everybody is related to each other in 1,000 different ways, because it was a very small founder population of a few hundred or thousands of people, and then they grew up to today's 5 million with a rapid expansion with development of agriculture. So they have a lot of diseases that were unusual because it just by chance happened to be the disease genes that were contained in that small population that founded it. We each have several variants that if we had 2 copies of them, we'd probably be sick, right? Certain genes turned off. And so in Finland, they just have different diseases than they have in Sweden, because they're more isolated, both linguistically and geographically. So it was very productive for finding the genes for all these unusual Finnish diseases. And so I started thinking about, what do we do for more common diseases? And I realized that, well, if we're looking at something pretty common, Finland's not that small, so not that isolated. So you need to go to more extreme places and look for more extreme, sort of unusual kind of natural experiments, because we can't really do experiments on humans. I can't say you and to some woman, I'd say, I want you two to have 20 kids and I'll raise 10 of them in cages.
Right, yeah.
Kind of chow. You have to look for where history's given you something that looks like an experiment you would do on a model organism. So it's kind of poor man's genetics, because in human biology, everything is observational. We can't do experiments. Whereas with mice, you do experiments, and Drosophila, you do experiments, yeast, you do experiments.
So I have a question. So this makes and we've talked about this before, about the gene and environment interaction enterprise, kind of a finicky, kind of tricky one to elucidate. Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to elucidate unless you do unusual sampling. So I had a study for years where, when I was a student at Columbia, which I was, many years ago, I took a class in Russian because it was like the end of the Cold War. It was the end of the Soviet Union. It was a really interesting thing to know about at that time. And I studied Chinese when I was an undergrad. And when I came to Columbia, I studied Korean. And so I was in a bookstore downtown, a Korean bookstore, and I saw a book that was written half in Korean, half in Russian. Of course, like, wow, this is interesting. And it was about Koreans in Kazakhstan. And I was kind of like, well, why are the Koreans in Kazakhstan? And it turned out they were deported there by Stalin in the 1930s. So they're basically moved from by the ocean to the most far place on earth from the ocean. They lost their culture, their traditions, and everything, but genetically, they're still the same. So we get the idea to do a study of the Korean diaspora to look at gene environment interaction. Because, for example, you have the same genes, but radically different culture and environment. So we look at Koreans in Korea, but we also had Koreans in Kazakhstan who are basically, they call themselves Homo Sovieticus. They're basically Soviet. And then there were adopted Koreans who were raised in Sweden. And they're also Korean, but their parents are tall blondes. And so they're completely Swedish, except biologically. So it makes an interesting study to look. It's kind of like with agriculture, you take the same plants and grow them in different soil and different climates and see what happens to them. And so that was some way to look at gene environment interaction in humans. Now, that's not usually what people do when they're looking at gene environment interaction. They just do the genes, measure the environment, and say, well, there's a correlation. But that correlation could be cause or effect, because your genes and your environment are not independent of each other, because we come from different cultures and those cultures correlate with our genes, and we have therefore different lifestyle, diet, and everything, even in New York City. As you know, you get on the subway, you come up in a different country. And in that different country you come up in, people eat different foods, they live differently, they have very traditional lifestyles, right? Even in Manhattan. So genes and culture are completely correlated, or highly correlated. Therefore, looking at interaction is almost impossible because you have correlation exposure.
It's interesting because I took a course on this last semester, well, in the spring, and my reading of it was exactly what you just talked about, but more fundamentally had a lot more to do with the downregulation of the stress response system, and how, you know, different hormones interact with the brain and the hypothalamus and all these different processes that keep a person stuck in a chronic state of stress, which then has downstream effects on their gene expression.
If you're looking at that kind of a trait. But if you're thinking about gene environment interaction, the simpler examples are things like lactose intolerance.
Okay.
Where, you know, we found the gene for that with my colleagues in Finland. And it's basically a variant that normally every human can digest lactose when they're children because they're drinking milk, right? Breastfeeding. But it normally gets turned off after weaning. And so it's normal for people not to be able to digest lactose as adults. But it was a new mutation several thousand years ago that arose together with dairy culture. They co-evolved, that allows people to digest milk as adults because it prevents the gene from being turned off. Okay. So in this case, if you drink milk and you can't digest it, then you have a problem, right? But if you don't drink milk, you have no problem. So that's a classic case of a gene environment interaction.
Right.
So response is another one. Like response to different drugs is a relationship between genes and the environmental factor of the drug. Addiction is a common one with substance abuse. Some people can break addiction like that. If they quit smoking, they're done. And other people can't. That's an interaction somehow between genes and environment.
Right.
That's
so
fascinating.
That's the normal models. The normal models have something to do with things like that, where it has to do with how you process something in the environment.
It reminds me of the what is it, the rat park or rat paradise experiment that I feel like is fairly well known, where they like provided rats with everything they could ever want, and then they introduced a drug, I think it was some sort of opiate, and found that they would just do that opiate until they died. But then you know what, I'm getting this messed up, but I think it was oh, I'm gonna get it wrong, but it had everything to do with what you were just saying, where when they changed the variables of the environment and then the addictive substance, you got really, really interesting results that suggested that things become more addictive for reasons outside of the physical addictive properties of the drugs themselves, and it has to do with the context of the environment
and the individual variation, of course. Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's how evolution works. In all of evolution, you have a lot of variation that's out there, some of which is good, some of which is bad. Most of it doesn't really matter that much. But when the environment changes, certain of those variables certain of those genetic factors can become very good in the new environment. So, for example, think about obesity in Northern Europeans. Northern Europeans may have a fair amount of this stuff here on the outside of the stomach.
For those listening, he's patting his belly.
Yeah. My big belly. Yeah, my subcutaneous fat. And that was advantageous in Northern Europe in the winter if you might not get food that often, right? Nothing grows and you kill an animal, you eat it, but you may have to have it for a while. So that's selectively advantageous in a culture where there's not regular food available. But it's a disadvantage today when we have all the food we can want. I mean, look at the Samoans. They didn't used to be NFL players. It was when they got all the access to Western diet and all the food that now they've just become enormous, right? That's clearly gene environment interaction.
Yeah, and I'm more skeptical of the work on, I don't know if you can really call it, I mean, you could call it work, sure, I'm being a little snarky, but the inheriting trauma. You hear about this?
I don't know much about that, but I mean, you mean your parents had trauma or you do? But I mean, your parents are nervous and on edge all the time. That's
I mean,
on edge. I don't know about mechanisms. I mean, there are examples. A friend of mine on the main campus, Oliver Hobart, he did some work with looking at transmissible effects of famine to second generation, third.
That I've seen, and that's I've seen that work.
And that was pretty interesting. It's really has to do with methylation that somehow is passed on. So there's so little that we know about biology that anything is possible. But when anyone says they know the answer to anything in biology, I kind of laugh at them because we're babies learning to crawl on the floor. And yet we have people telling the media that we're running marathons and curing diseases. And no, we're babies learning to crawl and learning the very basics. And the stuff that we know is almost all wrong in the details. We know that. There's just the best that we know right now. And we know that we constantly come up with better ideas and stuff as we move forward. But we know that everything we think now is grossly too simplistic and may not be useful. I mean, we're going to be laughed at for what we do today. Like we joke about people using bloodletting and leeches and stuff, which actually did work, you know?
Wait, let's slow down. It worked? Was it?
For some things, yeah. I mean, if you have brews and leeches and stuff, you can, you know.
Are you endorsing bloodletting, Joe? Is that what you're?
No, I'm saying most traditional medicine and things that people did in the past was based on experimentation. They may not have known why to do this or whatever, but they did things because it worked. It may not work very well, but these things did do something, right? Just like a lot of traditional medicines have some effect because people tried it over and over again and noticed the effect. It's why, for example, we don't eat very many carnivorous mammals because the livers are toxic and people ate the livers and died, and therefore they stopped eating the animal. Like it's common sense. It's like a lot of the traditional religious rules about eating pork and things like that are also based on public health. You saw repeatedly that people ate pork that wasn't well cooked and they got sick and died, and they called it a curse from God because they didn't understand the microbiology, but they weren't wrong, you know.
I mean, the effect was there. The effect was there, exactly.
Yeah, the effect was there. So people have always done this sort of thing, and we laugh about it now because we know better and we understand mechanism, but that doesn't mean it wasn't science.
Right. The explanation for the effect was oftentimes quite wrong, but they could see the cause and effect, like that relationship.
Yeah, and that's the case today still. The explanation in a lot of areas of science still pretty
well, everything in genetics is correlation with no mechanism.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can't do the aforementioned like horribly unethical human study, right?
Right.
So you kind of
And even when we find things, genetic markers that are correlated with a trait, we know that that one's probably not the one that's functional. It's something nearby because everything's correlated because things are inherited together on chromosomes. So it just makes it very difficult to ever really know things with a scientific rigor. And that's the way we have to be because there just aren't enough human beings to do good human genetic studies. Even if you had every person in the world's history sequenced and analyzed, it's nowhere near enough data to answer the question.
So, okay, so here's a question that relates to that. We didn't really talk about this beforehand, but maybe you have some thoughts on it. Is AI going to solve a lot of those problems eventually?
No, because the problem isn't the methods. The problem is there isn't enough data. So AI is basically some kind of like a zillion multiple regression type things. It's fitting models, right?
Yeah.
Right.
In order to fit models, you have to have enough data to train it on to fit the model. And there isn't really enough data to do that in humans because there's just too many variables and not enough data.
So we couldn't ever get that data. We couldn't ever map the entire genome and put it
Well,
in
we know
AI.
what's in the genome, but figuring out what every variant does, especially when they all interact with each other, it's a combinatoric problem that, I mean, AI, it may help people get some hypotheses, but it's not, the problem isn't the analytical tools. The problem is the complexity of the problem itself.
Right.
You
Is
know,
there any
like ask AI what is life and how to create life,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think it's going to do that. So
Right. I was just telling Anthony before we started recording, I, for fun, plugged in a song and asked ChatGPT to analyze the song for me, and it got everything wrong. The key, the time signature.
Yeah.
So I wasn't thinking it would happen anytime soon, but I take your point that even when it becomes highly efficient and very advanced, it's still not going to get to the root cause of the problem.
you still have to have enough data. You have to have enough data to answer the question. No matter, it's not a question of the method. It's just there's not enough data.
Is there anyone saying anything in terms of a solution to this conundrum? Is there anything theoretically that might help us
People
get further?
The basic approach of the field is that the NIH is basically saying we want to fund large multi-center studies where everybody gets together once a week and agrees to measure exactly the same things exactly the same way in all their samples that they collect, just so they can collect more and more data. But it's kind of foolish because that, first of all, makes it so scientists are not allowed to think, because you have to just coordinate and do something in a sort of robotic way where everybody measures exactly the same thing. And their argument is, oh, well, we don't need to think. AI will eventually figure it out when we have enough data. But I mean, there's not enough data. There's just
it's mistaking data processing for wisdom.
Yeah, or collecting data from doing science.
Yeah.
To me, the problem is like they're spending so much money on these giant behemoth studies that there's no money left for investigator-initiated research where someone has a creative idea and wants to try something with a small budget. I'd much rather see a large number of small projects where people are thinking, you know, and coming up with new ideas, because then you're also training students to think, and you're making sure scientists are engaged in thinking as opposed to just robotically measuring things identically to everybody else so that you can just get a lot of data collected. Because to me, that's not really science.
Right. And so is that what you are trying to do when you go to places like Finland or like, I think you said you went to Northern Canada, and I think Afghanistan very briefly as well?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest project over the last 30 years has been in Venezuela.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, in Venezuela, we've been following a cohort. They're indigenous population. They live on platforms on like piers over the top of the lake, with the bay. Basically, they call it a lake. And that's why it's called Venezuela, because when Vespucci landed there, they looked like little Venice, because they're all living over the water. And so these people were basically, it's one family that we've been following of 5,000 people. There's not a lot of genetic variation. There's like 5 or 10 surnames, you know, and they all live in this closed community. There's only like 5 foods that they eat. So it's reducing the dimensionality of the problem. And so we've been doing brain MRIs and 24-hour blood pressure monitoring longitudinally for the last 25, 30 years.
Wow.
And on a population of everyone that was over 50 in the community back then, or maybe even a little bit younger, and follow them all forward. And so we have 2 communities. One is that big family, and the other is an urban community that are upper middle class. These indigenous people are really poor. The upper middle class people live in the city center. They have all the benefits of better medical and better healthcare, better access to food, and of course, they're way less healthy. They have high rates of, you know, all the chronic Western diseases. Whereas in the indigenous community, if they live to be 40, there's a lot of violence and, you know, things in early life there. It's not a very nice place to be. But if you make it past 40, you're an elder statesman, and they often live to be 90 or 100, and their brains look perfect. There's no plaques.
Wow.
They don't have any real incidence of these common Western diseases, diabetes, cancers, and stuff, despite the fact that they're exposed to all the heavy metals from the oil industry, and they're all infected with ascaris because they they basically go to the bathroom through a hole in the floor, and then they swim in the water and eat the fish. And so they're constantly reinfected, but yet they're healthy. If they live to 40, they live very well and very long.
Do you think that has something to do with lifestyle? Is it?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with lifestyle, and potentially some people even believe maybe being infected with Ascaris helps the roundworm, because we always
like an immunity.
Well, we've always had parasites in our system throughout human evolution. Our immune system evolved together with it. And the immune system's like an army, and that's like your enemy, but there's a balance. They evolve together, right? So all of a sudden if you remove the enemy, like they've done in a lot of the rest of the world through medicine and other things,
antibiotics,
enemy, and it often ends up attacking itself aggressively, and that's what causes, to some extent, a lot of autoimmune diseases and a lot of inflammation and other things like that. Now, this is just speculation by some people, but it is remarkable that these people that are infected seem to be healthier.
Now, could you draw some conclusions about, well, more from a mechanistic human organismal perspective that could be generalized, like what we're seeing here could be generalized?
Well, I joked at the time that we should start selling roundworms in health food stores in Berkeley. And I was just joking, but there are actually people doing this now.
Oh, wow.
And there are people that are into the organic thing. They're actually, going for it. I'm sure I'm infected because I've been to a lot of places where it's endemic, and I never got the medicine, but I never had any symptoms, so I didn't worry about it. And I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe not so bad if I got something living in my stomach, crawling around in there.
The next social media ad, supported by science, this pill from Venezuela, Venezuelan study.
But, it's interesting working in Venezuela, though. It's like the models that are used everywhere in the world now they look at 24-hour blood pressure variation. You wear a harness and it measures it, throughout the day and the night to look at the changes. The algorithms that were developed by our colleagues, they were people from the Venezuelan oil industry who had worked with pressure in the pipelines. And they always noticed that it wasn't high pressure that caused problems in the pipelines. It was fluctuation in pressure, because pipelines would rupture when it would change rapidly. And so they had all these algorithms to look at the constancy of the pressure in the pipes. Well, those are the algorithms now that are used in all the machines worldwide that do 24-hour blood pressure monitoring, were the ones based on the Venezuelan oil industry. And it's actually interesting because it does show that the ones with this kind of greater variation are the ones that are at more risk of vascular damage than people with high blood pressure that's fairly constant.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
It's this fascinating underlying principle that rapid change tends to be the thing that's disruptive rather than more stable. And you can apply that to everything from the oil industry to human health. It's like a universal.
And the most interesting finding we had in that study in Venezuela was Zika virus. Remember Zika virus?
I remember that.
Yeah, it caused what was the $3 word? Microcephaly, the shrinking of the head.
Yeah. And we found in our population there were several people that had an inflammation of the optic nerve that led to blindness. It was something like that. And because we were doing eye screenings as well, because we were doing brain imaging and retinal scans to try to look at comparison of microcirculation in the eye and the brain. And because we had this eye clinic, we started noticing this was very common in the Zika virus people. So we were the first to report that. And actually, this is something very preventable, because if you catch it right away, you can deal with the inflammation and they don't go blind. So that was probably the most important finding, which had nothing to do with our hypothesis or study. It's because we had a cohort there, and when the environment changed and something happened, we had longitudinal data that we could measure the effects in. So we're also be able now to look at kind of the effects of the collapse of the economy in Venezuela, because Venezuela was doing very well in the 90s when we started it, and now it's not. There's a massive, societal collapse basically with the system there. So, and we're still able to keep this going and keep collecting data and keep working with them because we built a good relationship, And it also helps America because they don't see us all as evil. They see us, we're okay because we're helping their healthcare. We're providing services to them. And, it's good PR for us. We try to be. Whenever I go to one of these unusual places where we're not too popular, I try to be an ambassador for America to make them see that we're just like they are and we're nice people.
Well, I have no doubt that you're doing this country a great service with that, Joe. You're a likable guy.
I try, you know.
You do good stuff.
I try to spread the love, you know.
Oh, I'm sure you're doing a great job. But so it's everything you're talking about is so interesting. Just the complexity of the human genome and the particular things we evolve for, and how it's what it sounds like you're saying is the sort of hyper novelty of the modern world. Specifically with what we were talking about, in the sense that we aren't exposed to as many parasites or diseases as we used to, or at least we have medicines to get rid of them very, very quickly. How that actually, in a sense, is in one small way, at least a bad thing, because now it's possible, at least, that it's causing these autoimmune diseases, right?
Not causing, but allowing. It's
Right.
creating an environment where the
exacerbating the potential.
They can flare up.
And also, like kids, sometimes parents want the kids to be too clean with all the hand sanitizer and everything else. It's like in England, like in Northern Europe, they're much cleaner than Southern Europe. So Finns, they go to dirty Southern Europe, meaning Germany, and they all get Montezuma's revenge.
Wow.
You know, some of them do, because
That's
they're
so
not
funny.
exposed to much germs up there because they're hyper clean. You know.
Wonder what happens when they go to Southern Italy, where
Well, it's probably the same. You know,
my background.
Germany, Southern Italy, you know, Venezuela, you know.
Right.
I mean, I had a friend who he works at NASA, and he's a Finnish guy, and he's like this super strong muscle, super powerful guy. And he went to Puerto Rico, got bit by a mosquito, and had dengue fever, and he was on an inhale for 2 years, you know. And I was like, man, Finns are weak, but they're not. It's just that they're not exposed to all this stuff, and they forget about that when they go other places that, you know, maybe
more vulnerable.
They have to build up a tolerance, basically, right? Yeah.
And let your kids eat mud pies. Let them play in the dirt. Don't make them wash their hands before they eat dirt. You know, it's good to be exposed to this stuff, especially when you're young and your immune system's developing. You know?
Yeah, and it helps the immune system learn is the basic idea, right? It makes it robust.
Yeah, that's why vaccines work, right? They're exposing you to something so you learn about it.
Right. So this is all exceedingly fascinating, and I think for people like obviously you, but then me and Anthony as well, and probably a lot of people who might listen to this podcast, that is the case. Genetics is very interesting, and we see it as just this like piece of the human puzzle. But
all the research the important thing is that most of the research that lots and billions of dollars are being spent on is finding almost nothing. Because the problem is so complicated when you look at most diseases that kill most people. Most of them are affected by like thousands and thousands and thousands of variants that aren't independent of each other. And there's no way to actually put that all together into a model that can even predict anything. And people are trying really hard to predict people's future diseases, but even identical twins don't get the same diseases. I mean, more often than normal, but it's still high when twins have a concordance for a disease of 30 or 40%. That's really high. Well, that's not predictive.
Yeah, that's still not as high as you would think it would be. I think
it's not usefully predictive,
right?
For preventive medicine, really.
Right. A lot of people would hear identical twins and think, oh, this is this like gold mine for that kind of things. But
it is the gold mine for that kind of thing, but they're not identical.
They're not as much as you would think.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's studies of inbred rats looking at diabetes, where they noticed that there was an effect of how high off the floor the cage was on their risk of diabetes. And they're identical, they're clonal rats. But this is because they're stress.
Yeah, right.
Stress of being high off the ground is stress, you know.
So again, this is fascinating, and a lot of people I think would agree. However, I do get the sense that sometimes genetics can be a sort of controversial field. I mean, does that ever happen? Does this affect you in any way, that there seems to be this attachment to like a blank slate way of thinking about human beings?
Sure. I mean, look, the NIH has now made rules that we're not allowed to, in like a title of a grant or paper, mention ethnicity. And you have to allow for ethnicity in genetics, because every ethnic group has variation in the diseases they get and the etiology of those diseases. The causes are different. The major genes are different. I give an example, like with Alzheimer's disease, there's an ApoE4 is the most significant risk factor. We know it's a relative risk of 2 or 3 or something. It's not causative, but it's a big factor in white. In African Americans and Hispanics, it has a much smaller effect because it's much more common. It's the common allele in those places. So basically, it has no predictive value because everybody has it. and it doesn't appear to be the same mechanism.
Yeah.
You also can look at almost any rare disease you have. The rare variation in the world is all local because we're all families and mutations occur. And the rarer a mutation is, the more recently it occurred, which means it's geographically localized. So you're going to have different causes, say, of breast cancer in Finland than you're going to have in Ashkenazi Jews. They're going to be different alleles and different variables. And so, you know, there is so much that's tied to ethnicity. And plus, almost every disease has a different prevalence in different ethnicities. You know, if we look at sickle cell anemia and look across the genome and what predicts it, you're going to come up with markers that predict you're from Africa because that's where it's prevalent. It's not prevalent in the Arctic. So you're going to get these things that have nothing to do with mechanism that come out correlated. If you don't control for it. And so we're being told now that we're all the same genetically because the drug companies really want there to be, and they always did, they wanted there to be factors that are common across all ethnic groups that affect the same disease so they can make a drug that treats everybody. Whereas if you have to do one for every small population, there's no profit.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is how there are certain protective factors too that certain ethnicities seem to have. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I read a while back in a journal article about what was it, it was about alcohol metabolism in African Americans or African descent, not African Americans, African descent, and how they don't, this particular variation doesn't allow for certain addictive outcomes or is a protective factor. And so it's like it can go, if we don't know, if we don't parse out and understand the differences between the ethnicities, how are we supposed to do anything adaptive for our society if we just make it all kind of a blank?
Sure. I mean, it's a disservice to minorities, especially because most of the studies that have been done historically on genetics are of Europeans, right? Western Europeans. And so I'll give a good example where people got this wrong and caused a big problem. And that was in China, where, you know, in Western Europe, we all know that drinking milk is good for you, right? Because it prevents osteoporosis and it helps the protein and all that stuff. So they encourage people to drink milk, right? Well, China said, oh, this is obvious. So drink more milk program. And they tried to push milk on everyone in China, but everyone in China is lactose intolerant. Because the genes are different, right? So they all end up feeling bloated. And I remember talking to my friends over there and they're like, yeah, I drink milk all the time. It doesn't feel good. My stomach feels bad, but they tell me to drink it. So I'm drinking it because it's good for me. I'm like, it's not good for you. The thing is that there weren't studies of Chinese people who drank milk all their lives in old age because no Chinese people drank milk. They never had milk drinking as part of the culture. So you couldn't even do the study. And they just rely on the assumption that we're all the same and therefore, you know, blah, blah, blah. But you really need to do studies of every different group. I mean, in Finland, there's huge differences between Eastern Finland and Western Finland in risk of different diseases based on genetic factors as well as social factors.
So I'd imagine in that example, the Western Finns probably have more admixture with like Nordic peoples, like the Germanic.
Well, that's pretty much the same everywhere. It's more that the coastal Finland was the only part settled until maybe 400 or 500 years ago, and then people started moving inland. And so when they move inland, it's a small group. So they're like a subpopulation, and they're much more related to each other, like a big family, than the people on the coast. And also, any island place where there's a coast, they're never isolates because sailors always leave DNA behind. Like Iceland's not an Iceland. There's every sailor from everywhere left DNA there.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. But
you
also,
were in the service, you know what I mean.
I don't know what you mean. That's one way to put it. Yes. So this is fascinating, right? Because I understand. I think we all understand people's trepidation around race and differentiating people when we're also talking about genetics. There's a pretty sordid history with I guess what you would call scientific racism and all that kind of nasty thinking, like, you know, people's the structure of someone's skull will determine their intelligence, like all that bullshit, right?
There's perhaps the biggest problem in America when it comes to racism and all this other stuff is nobody understands statistics.
That's so
Every
true.
little boy when I was a kid played with
So true.
baseball cards, and you knew a batting average is a probability. You knew an earned run average is an expectation. We knew this stuff, but no one explained to us what it meant or how it's used.
That's very true.
And when you see a difference between groups in height or any trait at all, that difference is small relative to the variance. So the variance means that while there may be group differences in every trait, any trait, blood pressure, height, weight, whatever, the differences are the mean differences are real, but the variance is such that most people could be on either side of the mean. You know, it's like there's so much overlap that it means nothing.
Right.
Yeah. So
IQ is an example.
And that's, I mean, you can have a million debates about how to measure that and what it means and all that stuff. But the bottom line is, like every other trait, sure, there's going to be differences on average between populations, but most people, the variance is so big
Cross-culturally.
there's no distinction. You can't infer anything about a person from membership in a group.
Right.
And so this is where we go wrong. It's like people just don't understand statistics. You need to start teaching this to kids.
I completely agree with you 100%.
So men are taller than women. Men are taller than women.
Yes.
That's not a sexist statement, but I've dated one woman who was taller than me, and I'm 6'4".
Wow. Actually, that's very tall, actually.
It was great. I liked it. But I'm just saying, you can't say because it's a woman, it's short.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think kind of this illiteracy with what we talk about when we talk about averages and means and variance, you know, on either side of the mean.
Plus or minus on
right, plus or minus, exactly. I think that causes a lot of confusion, yes. And I'm trying to formulate a question based on, because you keep using the term ethnicity, right? But also there's a problem in our culture, in our nation culturally, right? With this conversation around race. And so very quickly, I was in a biological anthropology class, like a human anthropology class that was looking at human and primate evolution. And one of the things our professor, fun fact, by the way, this was when I was at University of Arkansas, and apparently they have like a world-class anthropology program, like biological fun. I'm wearing the shirt right now for those who can't see,
cool.
Which is really interesting. And this guy who seemed to really know his stuff, he's a very smart professor from what I could tell. And the thing he emphasized was race is not really real. And so I think there's a sense in which he's correct and which he's incorrect, right? Which is like race as we formulate it or historically in our past of the United States, as we formulate it, has been deeply inaccurate. Well, there is something like race that's real, and it's what seems to be what you're getting at with ethnicity.
What I would say when people talk about race in America in 1960, it was a categorical variable, because Africans were from a certain part of Africa. Asians were from China, basically, maybe some from Japan. And Europeans were from a group that was, mostly coastal Europe. There was some more variation after World War II, but it was mostly, Britain, Germany, Netherlands, some Italy. Right. So those are three groups that are geographically very dispersed from each other to the point where they are categorically different. We didn't have the people in the middle in America in 1960. Now we have more of them. And if you look worldwide, of course, variation is continuous with geography. So borders don't mean anything. There's no difference between a Northern Korean and a Manchurian genetically, because they're so close together that throughout human history, if you could find it, it, right? And you had kids.
Another great euphemism, Joe.
Yeah, you it. But that's the golden rule, basically, right? If you find it, you And so variation in genetics is continuous. Now, there are major barriers like the Sahara Desert, where there weren't a lot of people, and that led to a bigger difference with respect to distance because there were no people in those areas. When you have mountain ranges like between India and China, you see a big categorical difference in the way people are genetically. That's because you can't them. Himalayas are in the way.
You're by the mountain in between you.
Exactly. So there are barriers to this rule, but other than that, variation is continuous with respect to distance.
Right.
But America was a sampling error. It's an ascertainment bias where we sampled three very disparate regions of the world, and they were significantly enough different that you could identify genetically, culturally, and everything with those differences. So it wasn't meaningless in 1950.
Right. Well, and
Today,
it sounds
it's
like,
leaving it because the middle ground is now filling in America. We're getting immigrants from the rest of the world.
and we're also, there's a lot more racial mixing. So you have a lot more mixed race
Sure.
people on top of that. Right. So
Yeah.
it sounds like, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's one of those things where, the system we came up with based on skin tone was fundamentally flawed in its reasoning, but happened to be right because it just so happened that all the people with black skin were coming from one geographic
Right.
area in Africa. Whereas if we were getting them from all over Africa, which is quite genetically diverse,
Sure.
it would have been highly inaccurate. So it's almost like the racists sort of lucked into something that was approximating something that was true. And the same thing with like East Asians. Most of them were coming from either Japan or China, or the Europeans were all like Northern European Germanic, at least like 80% plus, right?
Yeah.
So like white makes sense if the white people, quote unquote, that you're talking about are all actually from a relatively specific part of the world that where white people live. But if you were getting, quote unquote, white people from, Finland and England, but also Italy and Spain in equal number, it would start to be a lot less reliable.
Right. And that's why, like, in a genetic study, white is a stupid designation because it treats Finns and Iranians and Spanish as if they're the same. And even Eastern and Western Finland are different when you look at it close enough. So you really need to be careful in sampling. In America, of course, you got all the people like me that aren't from anywhere, really. We're the melting pot of the first 300 years of America. Because, anyone who went through upstate New York left DNA in one of my relatives. And, that's why all the 23andMe's and all those companies couldn't even figure out my ancestry because it's too complicated. Because I'm white trash. And white trash is a specific country,
Is that a category?
You're among brethren.
Well, I call myself white trash because I'm allowed to. You have to call me Appalachian American.
Hey, as a fellow descendant of Appalachian Americans, I'm also allowed to say white trash. I'm wearing an Arkansas shirt right now, Joe. Come on.
Exactly.
Yeah, I never know what to put on the form when it's, the race form for, I have to put white, and, I'm Southern Italian. I'm pretty sure I have Northern African. I'm pretty sure I have Iranian. I mean, it's like,
the other thing is that those definitions don't really mean anything anyway, because it's all continuous variation.
right.
So variation is all continuous. And, North Africa, in genetic, in NIH, they call them white anyway.
Interesting.
Arabs are called white by NIH.
That's interesting. So
we don't get any credit. We don't get any credit when we do studies in North Africa for having sampling from diversity.
Well, so it seems like we have to, like, I think this is the thing that trips people up, because they're hearing someone who wasn't familiar with this sort of thing or with genetics. We hear this and think, okay, so you're saying it's not important because of variation, but also you're saying that there was a point to our earlier racial categories, but also you're saying ethnicity is really important. And I can understand where people get really confused. And it's like, ethnicity is like, I think from what you're saying, it's like a mean based on common ancestry, but there's a lot of variation on either side of that mean. So it's sort of both. It's like, you can't make assumptions about a person, too many assumptions about a person based on their ethnic category, but you can make some fairly reliable assumptions based on a group based on their ethnic categories. Is that kind of right?
Well, I mean, there's certain things that you can say, like, I probably don't have sickle cell anemia.
Right.
Anthony might have a beta thalassemia because he's from that part of the world, right? So there are certain
What
things.
is that?
It's like a different way that a different protection for malaria that's common in Mediterranean.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing is maybe people don't realize this, but sickle cell, it seems like maladaptive. If you're in an area with lots of malaria,
right? Sure,
it might be extremely helpful because it actually helps you or prevents you from getting the disease, right?
Well, I would always say that, when I teach my class on evolution, I make everyone watch the beginning of the movie Idiocracy, because it's it teaches an important point that natural selection doesn't care about anything other than how many kids you have and how many kids they have. It's who passes on their genes more. And that doesn't mean good. It doesn't mean bad. It just means who passes on their genes more. That's all that biology cares about. So I'm biologically probably not very fit because I don't have any kids that I know of, but you never know, but the thing is that, no, I mean, the thing is that that's what matters. And the people that are having the most kids today are not necessarily the smartest or the strongest. They're in some cases the people who can't afford birth control.
Right. So yeah, because you would think, because so many people complain about the cost of childcare and all of that, and that's why people aren't having kids. But then you look at the data and you see that poverty doesn't really correlate super well with having less kids, and that
It's the
people
opposite.
It's the opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right. Yeah.
And it has to do with like, I imagine it has to do with like access to birth control, education,
And also,
just culture.
like they show in the beginning of Idiocracy, they have the couple, they're in school and say, oh, well, we're kind of young. I want to develop my career. We'll wait to have kids. And they wait a
Right.
while. Well, the stock market, the way it is now, it's not the right time. And then they wait a little longer and they say, well, now my husband, his low sperm count, we have to go. It's these things that happen.
It's like a neurosis.
Reality, though. It's reality, though.
Yeah.
Everywhere in the developing world, the family sizes are getting smaller and smaller. And in the other rest of the world, they're staying big and bigger and bigger, and actually more surviving because we're able to treat childhood diseases better.
Right.
So it's a massive change in the dynamics of human evolution in the next couple of generations. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying it's not working to make things necessarily better, except better meaning those who have more kids wins.
So it's like it's like inverse relationship. It's like we might say that people in poverty have access, less education, but it could actually be working for them in an evolutionary sense. Whereas we have this neurotic tendency to micromanage everything, and we see that population. Now, tell me if this is correct. The world population, is it steady or is it actually starting to decline a bit?
It's growing.
Growing, is it? Interesting.
The developing world is growing fast.
Well, it's a little more, it's a little nuanced, right? Because we're still growing because people are living longer, but birth rates are going down.
That's what I meant.
In the developed countries.
Yes. That's what, and that's I'm trying to draw that
in the other countries.
And that's the connection I'm trying to.
In Africa.
Look at in Africa, there's many countries where the median age is like 18.
Right.
That's why there's a lot of social problems. And it's one of the attractions for extremist groups is that these kids have no hope because there's too many of them and there's no jobs and there's no economic future. And so that's
right. You and I were talking about this. What was it? I think it was last night, or the night before, when we went to that Kat Timpf interview for the Reason thing, and you were talking about like young male syndrome. Basically, you've got all these young guys who can't get laid and they're frustrated, and who can blame them, right? They have no opportunities.
Some of them don't care; they just want to play video games.
Yeah, well, those aren't the ones to worry about in a sense, right? Because those are the ones at home playing video games. It's the guys who aren't at home playing video games that you need to worry about. Yeah.
And it's a bigger problem when you're in countries where everybody's young and they don't see a future.
Right.
Now, you talk often about the opposite problem in China, where there's too many old people and not enough young people. Mm-hmm. But China is also starting to forge closer and closer ties with Africa, where they have the opposite problem, and maybe something will come of that, I
mean, maybe, but aren't Chinese, they kind of have a notorious reputation for being a little bit, Han Chinese, a little bit of racism in that society, no?
Sure, but they need people to work, and so they're investing heavily in sub-Saharan Africa.
That makes a lot of sense. My mind goes to, I think it was a Chinese, it might have been Japanese or Korean commercial where the lady puts the African guy in a dishwasher and like what is it, a clothes, like a washing machine, and he comes out like Chinese, he comes out Asian.
Oh,
just like,
well,
you can look it up. It's outrageous.
And we're bad here. No,
I was in North Korea with a bunch of basketball players, and one of them was Charles Smith, and one of the Korean guys shook his hand and then looked to see if it rubbed off, and he said he's embarrassed to Charles, and Charles says, "Don't worry, I know you don't know any better. You've never seen African guy before." He goes, "So it's all cool," and he was not upset by it, but that was their reaction initially. Was
that's so I'm glad you brought that up, because
we have to pivot to that. I think
we have to pivot to that because I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but I really want to get to this. You have some crazy stories, Joe. I will tell everyone that's listening,
interesting parts of the world, because that's where you go when you want to do interesting genetics. You go to places that are isolated geographically, culturally, politically, and those tend to be the same places.
Yes, and you have gone to some very interesting places and met some very interesting people. I will say just very quickly for our listeners, I've talked to Joe. I don't know. We've had countless conversations since we met. And almost every time we have a conversation that lasts longer than 5 minutes, you say something where I go, what the hell did you just tell me? And you just like so nonchalant, like, oh yeah, that one time I went to North Korea with Dennis Rodman. Like that's a normal thing that normal people say. People don't hang out with Dennis Rodman in North Korea, Joe. That's just you, pretty much.
For one, people don't hang out with Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
No.
So start off with that. So you are not unfamiliar with
Cat Tinfa we met the other night. She has a crush on him. So she said that if she had $1 million, all she'd want to spend it on was to buy the wedding dress he used to marry himself. And I'm thinking, I can arrange that.
Oh my God. So let's regale our listeners with this incredible. So you tell us your background with Korean and North Korea. Like, how'd you get into the language and how'd you end up going there eventually?
Well, I mentioned before that we had this study of gene environment interaction looking at overseas Koreans in Kazakhstan and in China, which are on the North Korean border. And until about the year 2000, the Koreans in China and Kazakhstan only had relations with North Korea. They had nothing with South Korea. Now it's changed a lot. Now it's almost the other way around. But back then, because it was still, the communist era, post-Soviet, that's where all the relations were. So I met a lot of North Koreans when I was working in Kazakhstan and working in China, and they were nothing like the stereotype we have of North Korea. And I was pretty educated. I mean, I studied Korean because I was interested in the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was interested in what was going to happen in North Korea back when I was a student at Columbia. And so I just thought, well, gee, I've got to learn more about this. Because these North Koreans are such nice people. They're all innocent. They're like, hi, how are you? And like super duper friendly, which is the exact opposite of the stereotype most people have of them.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, I got to go there. So I eventually went a couple times as a tourist, but then I got a notification from the American Statistical Association that they were looking for people to go on a program to North Korea to teach government officials how to do statistics for census and other stuff. So I applied. They had a voir dire, where they tried to make sure we weren't crazy or we weren't like going over there to proselytize or anything like that. And I passed that. And when it came time to get the visas, out of the 30 or 40 people who were going to go, I was the only one they gave a visa to. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because I'd been there a few times before and they felt like, they could trust me. But so then they asked me instead if I would teach at this university there run by Americans, which is the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. And I jumped at the chance to go there and teach human genetics for the summer that year. And basically you're living on campus with North Koreans, eating all your meals with them, hanging out with them 24/7. They have a resident visa in North Korea, so we could go around the country, shop where they shop, live the way they live, to the extent you can as a foreigner. And it was just a fascinating experience, and I really was really into it. And so
really quickly before we go, just very quickly, what was that like? Like, how does the stereotype of them constantly being malnourished and only wearing gray, and does that like match with reality at all? To what degree?
I mean, not really. I mean, they have their own style. They get to pick which kind of pin they want, for example, with the leader on it. The students wear uniforms most of the time, but on the weekends they wear whatever they want. You could tell the rich kids would have on their NBA t-shirts or Barcelona soccer shirts or something like that. And their baseball caps and all the rest. So, they had their day when they could be individuals, and they were. We're very individualistic. Sure, I mean, there's a standard kind of clothes people wear, but you get to choose. You have a lot of freedom within what's available. Mm-hmm. And also the people are they're extremely nice. That's the thing. It's like they're basically, I wanted to get a North Korean education. So I got one of these here, which is a North Korean laptop. And it has all the textbooks on it that they use from kindergarten through high school. And from here, I could read whatever they read. So I got myself a North Korean high school education, basically. And they have classes on like the childhood of Kim Il-sung, the childhood of Kim Jong-il, and they have classes on what they call socialist ethics. And what was remarkable to me is that they're all basically the same stuff I read in Sunday school without the magic.
Oh, wow.
Oh, okay.
It's the same values. It's like be nice to people. And in a way, if you think about it, Jesus is a socialist, right? He gave bread and wine to everybody. He shared it with all the people, and it was charity. In
philosophy,
well, you might piss off some people with that comment. Jesus was American, Joe. But
oh, I forgot. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, Jesus was
a gun-loving, God-fearing capitalist.
He was a white hippie American.
He was a cat-eating, dog-eating migrant
I've eaten dog many times, and it's not so bad.
In Korea?
In North Korea, in South Korea, in Russia,
Is
China.
it as good as I saw like I saw on like a podcast with like Bobby Lee and that he was talking about it's supposed to be really delicious? Is it?
I liked it. I mean, I like it. It's a little gamey because it's one of the few carnivorous animals or omnivorous mammals that we actually eat.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying before, we don't eat them because they're not good for us, but dog and bear are like the only two humans really eat. The rest are all herbivores.
I will say I hear bear is quite delicious, so maybe it's similar.
Really?
Well, it's salty. It's gamey. So, you don't want too much of it. Like with dog, they tell you don't eat it more than once every 2 weeks because it's a little bit toxic. That's what the North Koreans say, but in a way, there's some truth in that because carnivorous mammals are a little bit toxic.
Right. Okay, so I don't want to get us too off track. So you made it to
anyway,
North Korea.
I was there living at this university, and we're eating meals with the students all the time. It'd be 3 students and a professor at each table, and really getting to know them. And so one night while I was there was Dennis Rodman's first trip to North Korea with the Harlem Globetrotters. And the students all came in the next day, they're all tired. They said, yeah, we had to stay up late last night to watch this game on TV. And there was this funny looking American saying nice things about our country and our leader. And it made me reevaluate my stereotype of Americans. And I'm like, yeah, in my mind, that's the whole point. That's why I'm here. That's why we're all here. We want to make them understand that we're nice people and we're not all trying to kill them, which is how they see the world.
Mm-hmm.
We've been threatening their regime with nuclear weapons and everything for 50 years. And so they feel like they're under threat from America and that we're all these scary, mean people that want to kill them. And it's not true. So I got on board after that. I said, I got to find a way to meet this guy. So when I got back to the States, there was a charity auction to play basketball with Dennis Rodman, to play horse. And I spent $2,500 or so, and I got to play basketball. I won the auction. And it was fun because that day there was a Sports Illustrated writer following Dennis around because it was also the day of the finale of Celebrity Apprentice that he was on with Trump.
It's a Trump connection.
Yeah. So the day I met him was the day of the final of Celebrity Apprentice where Dennis got fired because he spelled Melania's name wrong. Lost because of that. But so we basically shot hoops for an hour and we just talked about Korea. And he goes, yeah, I want to go back. I don't know how though. The travel agent said I couldn't buy a ticket. I said, oh, no problem. I can help you. I'll help you out. And so I got on board and I helped arrange his next trip with meeting with the North Korean diplomats in New York. And we all went back in September and spent a few days at Kim Jong-un's house.
Okay, so that's the next big reveal here.
What was that?
You have personally met Kim Jong-un, yes?
I held his daughter in my arms, the one you see on TV all the time when she was a baby. And we're the ones that told the world her name because he told us what her name was. And, we told the press.
Wow.
Wild.
What was he like?
He's very smart and friendly, funny guy. He's very charismatic. And so we just hung out, basically. We had Dennis and him were riding horses that Putin gave to Kim Jong-il. Then they were smoking a bunch of cigars that Fidel Castro gave to Kim Jong-il, but Kim Jong-il didn't like cigars, so he gave the box of cigars to Dennis, and he smoked all of them. Like Dennis too.
Wow.
It was pretty fun.
So Dennis and Kim Jong-un like legitimately got along.
Yeah. They're buds, they're friends. Yeah.
Wow.
No, and Kim was just really friendly with us. And Dennis would say something crazy, and he'd always have a funny comment within seconds. And it's like he has that quick wit, and very good natured. He was very good natured with us.
That's like exactly. I mean, I think I will say, Joe, you keep saying this, you keep referencing this stereotype Americans might have about North Koreans. I would disagree a little bit. I think most Americans, if you were to ask them, like, what do you think the average North Korean is like? I bet a lot of people would say, oh, they're probably pretty nice. They probably are brainwashed a little bit, but I bet they're good people. So it's not surprising that those people are nice. I think people would be very surprised to learn that Kim Jong-un, at least interpersonally, was this like charismatic, nice guy. Because I think the stereotype of him is like the quintessential bad guy, right? The villain.
Sure, well, I'd imagine him being charismatic though, with that dictatorial persona.
I mean, again, you got to remember that this guy, his dad died, and suddenly he's in this position. He didn't choose to do it. He didn't do anything to become dictator. He was just there. You know what I'm saying? So he was charged in the International Criminal Court based on the testimony of stuff from defectors who left before he was president. Because it's this whole idea that you demonize the system, which has a lot of flaws, but it became personal. And it's like, he's not responsible for things his father did. Although I guess nowadays in America, you know, we're charging the parents of kids that shoot up schools with the murder, right? So we're starting to do the inheritable guilt as well, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, we've been accusing them based on that. And he kept saying to us, he goes, these old guys don't let me do anything, you know, because you don't give the kids the keys to the car. And we met when he just started, you know, and he obviously, like any other leader, has to appeal to the royal classes, right? The deep state. And he is a deep state. And they're very conservative because they all know that America openly states we want to change their regime. And they know that if we change the regime, we saw what happened in Iraq. Everybody affiliated with the Ba'ath Party was stripped out of government and, you know, made not eligible to participate in the future, which is part of why no one was left who knew how to run a government, and ISIS took over, right?
Vacuum.
Yeah. You get rid of everyone with skills just because of their affiliation. But everyone there knows that. They all know that they're affiliated, they're, you know, elites in that society. And if the regime changes, they're all fucked. So they don't want that. They want very conservative small steps on anything. So I mean, it's not like you can put blame for what happens on an individual when it's the problem of the system. And the system is characterized by inertia, because I've seen many times where Kim Jong-un or one of the ministers will say, you can do this. And someone 7 levels lower will come to us and say, you can't do that. Because there's a person 7 levels lower who's actually the one who'd get in trouble if something goes wrong. Right? Not the guy on top. So it's a very conservative system where it's full of, almost everyone I've met there is the same. They're all like, hi, and they're very innocent and friendly because they're in a system kind of where there's not a lot of personal responsibility for your outcome in life. It's sort of, we're in this together, it's collective. It's like children in a household dependent on the parents or the government. And so they kind of keep that innocence of children in many ways. So I kind of look at it, and it's kind of like I understand in a way the reluctance to let a lot of outside information in, because it's kind of like Pandora's box, and they know that. And they know it is, their analogy often is like paradise on earth, but it's kind of Garden of Eden like before original sin. And they're afraid of letting in original sin. That's why the internet and stuff like that and everything is so closed, because they're so innocent, these people. And you look at them and they're like so nice and so sweet, but yet so naive. And that's what happens when you're in a society where you don't have a lot of freedom, but the price you pay for that is you don't have a lot of individual responsibility either. So there's no stress.
Right.
So they're very relaxed, and life is easy if you're there, because whatever you do, the outcome is going to be the same. So there's no reason to work real hard.
It's so easy for us to fill in the blanks because it's so elusive. It's so hidden from our sight. So we'll jump to heuristics. We'll just come up with stories, and it's so amazing to hear these gaps filled in from somebody who's
the World Health Organization does these things where they predict the like they had one about suicide, where you know, South Korea has the highest suicide rate in the OECD countries. So they didn't have any data from North Korea, and they had data from China. And they interpolated first the risk factors, meaning that in South Korea, poverty was a risk factor for suicide, stress, and you know, all these things were the risk factors. And they said, well, in North Korea, it must be even more poverty and more risk factors. So they then imputed that North Korea must have the world's highest suicide rate. So they came up with a report that said North Korea has world's highest suicide rate, when even the South Korean government says suicide is very rare in North Korea.
Wow.
But this is because they try to fill in all the gaps, have complete data, and they do it by interpolation and imputation, and it just leads to total crap. And that's a good example about crap psychiatry from WHO.
Well, and even to a layman like me, that seems silly, because from what I understand, a lot of like depression and suicide comes from comparing yourself to others. So in a society where there are people like in ours, where there are people who are crazy successful and people who, you know, work at 7-Eleven their whole lives, that can cause a lot of problems. But like you said, if you're in North Korea, everyone's kind of in the same situation, except for a very, very, very tiny elite few. So it's like your neighbor's doing just as badly or as good as you are.
That's right. A good friend of mine was a Korean from Uzbekistan. She's a psychiatrist in Moscow now. And she was when she was a kid, her father was in the party, and she was active in Komsomolets, which is the Young Communist Youth League in the Soviet Union. And she told me, she said, in Soviet times, we didn't know we were poor, so we were happy. And we had a sense of community because we were all in this together and everybody sort of looked out for each other. She goes, now in Russia, they had a lot more freedom. They have a lot more stuff. So she's making way more money and has a much higher standard of living. But she also sees that everybody else, the people that have much better and much worse. And she said, and also people don't care about each other anymore. It's all about themselves, because that's kind of what capitalism does in a way. And I'm a libertarian. I'm all for capitalism. But it does make you insular. And urban society in America, I don't know who lives next door to me. And I live in university housing and I still don't know who lives next door to me. Imagine the average person in New York. We don't have this sense of community and tribalism that we've always had as a species, where you were in a group of a couple of hundred people and you knew where everyone fit and where you fit. And it was a group activity. Today, it's so cellular and individualistic that I think is part of the reason why in New York and Seoul, you have so many people in psychiatric therapy, or who need to be but aren't. And it's partly because this is just an unnatural way for humans to live compared to how we always were in history. And the communists at least got the community part right, the root of communism, which is you put people in these groups where even in the cities, they're in a work group, they're in a social group. And, that actually makes them feel like they're in it together. It's the big complaint defectors in South Korea have, is that they feel isolated and there's no support system. And that's why so many are trying to go back to North Korea.
Yeah, it's that social component. That is a good point about communism, or those collectivist societies, how you have that one component that, that sort of competence hierarchy, and people below the most competent will aspire to, sort of, but not only that, also the affiliative nature of being in that cooperative kind of society, but it's the economic stuff that always falls to shit. But
sure. I mean, we had students would cheat on an exam, and I'd know who cheated, and everyone else would take the blame because he didn't want anyone getting in trouble.
Yeah.
They all kind of protect each other from this.
Right.
Because they all understand that if someone gets in trouble, it's bad, not only for that person, but for the rest of their group that has one less person doing all the work. It's something that is a strength. And it's also where most people get their happiness from, is from their social circles, their friends, their family. It's not from having a lot of stuff. You can be really rich and really miserable, right? And a lot of people are. And yet you can be really poor and be very happy. And if you ask people, are you happy? It seems to be inversely related to income and to GDP around the world. Of course, then sociologists realized that that's not the result they wanted. So they changed the definition of happiness to be access to healthcare, access to education, the Nordic model. And that's why the Nordic countries come out the happiest. Well, no one in those countries thinks they're happy. They think we're content, it's okay, but happy, give me a break.
And then coming full circle to disease, to what you said earlier about the poverty stricken populations versus the more developed Western sort of having
same, like we're starting a study on the Mexican border, and of course people on the Mexican side are healthier.
That's so interesting. Well,
because in Texas they drive their car to get the mail out of the mailbox. They're all fat and diabetic,
right?
In Brownsville, and then you go to Matamoros and they walk everywhere, and they're not having as much of the unhealthy Texan-sized food, and so they're healthier.
Right.
And there's a great everybody wants to be Western, and it's not necessarily always better.
There's a great Vice piece by Michael Moynihan from years ago, and he went to, I think it was Finland, and asked people exactly about that thing that you're referencing, that happiness index. And everyone was like, well, I'm doing all right. Like, I'm content. And one of the things I think one of the people he interviewed said was, people aren't really happy, but we're not comparing ourselves to people who are like way better than us all the time. So we're not miserable. Right.
There's not a lot of variation in Finland either in economic status, unless you inherit it. The only way you can be rich in Finland is to inherit it.
So people are just kind of like roundly content and not a lot of misery per se.
But they have one of the highest suicide rates in Europe.
Okay, well then there is that. So it's like weird. It's
there's a seasonal depression every winter. They call it gamos, where the whole country's depressed.
Right, because they don't see the sun for months.
Whatever, we're all depressed. Their national anthem has the line in it that says Finland's a poor country. You know, because they just see they have to work hard so that it doesn't become poor again, right?
Yeah. Well, it's yeah, it's just an interesting trend. Like you're right, we kind of confuse markers of comfort for markers of happiness is what it sounds like. But what I have heard is that there is like a sort of point of diminishing returns where it's something like, I might be getting this wrong, like 70 to $80,000 a year correlates pretty well with happiness, because let's face it, if you're starving or if you can't pay the rent, you're stressed about the rent, that will make you unhappy. But once you get to about 70 to 80K, somewhere in that range, you are actually progressively getting happier. Past that, it like levels off, right? That's what the data shows, as far as I am aware.
Yeah.
And sometimes dips a little bit, right? Because it's like,
right.
I was thinking about this the other day. You know, I live on a very meager sum. I live on my post 9/11 GI Bill benefits, which is not a lot of money. And I remember thinking like, man, if I had an extra like $30,000-$40,000 a year, I would be a lot happier. But then I thought, if I made 200K a year, I don't know how much happier I would be. Like, even thinking about it from my position.
Well, also in New York, if you make 200K or 40K, you don't have that much difference in money because of the taxes.
That's right.
That's a good point, actually.
But
I mean,
actually,
I get like 50% take-home pay.
That's just wild.
Mike. But think about it like
in Finland, at least you free education, free healthcare.
And then you have all the other stuff. Yeah,
you look at all that money going to Uncle Sam, and that's why you're a libertarian, right? Like you see.
I'm like, in Finland, at least I get something back for the money I pay. Where there, it's maybe 30%. Here, it's on the same salary, it would be 50%, and I don't really think I get anything.
Well, there's a lot of
we get to bomb a lot
of the subways, which are quite charming. So that's one thing.
What on the subways?
I've seen a lot of, you know what I've seen a lot on the subways, Joe? I've seen a lot of self-ing.
Oh yeah,
your phraseology. I've seen that once or twice.
When?
So, you know,
I mean, I'm not.
a little bit of character, I guess.
I'm not surprised.
168th Street. It's the really deep subway station, so people live there, and if you go there early in the morning or you go to some of the less well-lit places, people do what people do with each other.
Oh god, yeah. No, point taken.
So I think that's the thing. The thing though that I get most from traveling the world is that there are no poor people in America. I mean, I've been to Afghanistan where people live in houses made out of shit, literally made out of shit, and they eat like fermented rotten milk, and then shit will fall in the milk off the ceiling, and they just pick it out and keep going. I did the same thing. And I mean, these people don't know what electricity is. Probably they don't have it, they can't read, they don't know why they're being bombed because they don't even know 9/11 happened. Those are poor people,
right?
You know, the poorest people in America, they even have cell phone charging stations for them downtown, right, where there used to be payphones. You know, it's like, okay, that's way better off. The poor people in America are still in the top.
Well, everything is relative then.
Materially, they're better off. But is it not the case that those poor people, a lot of them are in communities at least?
Sure.
I had a friend from India. I mean, India's
but that goes back to my argument about the communal thing being
exactly
happy in a lot of these countries.
I think we watched Slumdog Millionaire or something like that together, and I was commenting, like, man, there's some real poverty there. And he goes, you don't understand. Like, I've been to India. Poverty there is not the same as poverty here. It's worse materially by a lot, but it's better psychologically because everyone around you is poor and everyone's kind of enduring it together.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. You'd mentioned about comparison before, Clay, about comparison being a huge driving force for mental health problems, leading to potentially exacerbating suicidality. And if you have a temperament that's already anxious and you're pushing and pushing and pushing to get beyond where you are in life, like you're low bottom at the totem pole, when you get to a certain threshold and you have more options, you still carry that anxiety with you. So in this culture, so it follows, you know, that this, like Joe was saying, with this kind of culture that we have, it kind of follows you no matter where you go. Whereas in these other societies, it's sort of, you do have that communal, attenuates the stress of being isolated. Like you're saying, you know, poverty. Yeah, that's what I say is like relative. Here, I would find maybe psychologically to be different.
Here, it's even middle class and upper middle class people, right?
Yeah.
Like, no, but I mean, that's the thing. New York is so many people and so much loneliness.
Yeah.
It's the busiest, lonely city. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
or
the
most cities.
nature. That's the nature of our sort of society, where it's individual driven, individual based. And again, I'm a libertarian. I like individual freedom, individual choice, individual responsibility. But you have to acknowledge that the other side, that it's about this sort of
There's a
like
trade-off.
In China, they
The
always say
trade-off. Yeah.
in China, they don't care so much about individual freedom. They care about stability and the community. And that's kind of the difference between the sort of Confucianist Asian cultures and the West, is this idea that what they want is just stability and they don't really care that much about the individual. I don't like that because I'm an individualist. I would not do well in one of those societies, but maybe more people would do well than we like to think because we're the exceptions. I used to think everybody wanted freedom and wanted to be a libertarian. We just didn't sell the message properly. I don't think that anymore because I think there's a lot of people that want to be in their mom's basement until they're 50 because it's easy. You give up all your freedom because you live under my house, you live under my rules, but it's easy. And I think people like easy. There's an attraction to that. And so it's this battle again between left and right in politics is often the difference between freedom and security. And how much freedom do you want to give up to get security? Because freedom is hard. Freedom means you got to take more responsibility, do more work, and you got to solve your own problems. And I'm starting to think more and more people prefer to let somebody else take care of their problems because it's easier.
I share
I
that.
don't like that. I don't like that
share the
outlook, but I
concern.
think it's
Yeah.
true.
Pretty good
Free,
synthesis.
brother.
And that to me is the difference between, and that's something I learned by living in North Korea for a while, where I don't think they're unhappy. The average person is unhappy. The poor people are just, they're not worried about politics. They're just worried about feeding themselves and getting through the day. But the middle class people are, well, life is pretty easy. You don't have to work real hard because you don't benefit from it. So why do it? And yet you have your community, you have your family, and all people talk about there is their family and their kids and all that stuff, like anywhere else. And I just think that we have the misconception of it because we think that we're happy somehow. And I don't think New Yorkers are happy.
I'd agree with you.
I'm pretty happy, but that's my personality, and I
would
am
agree
an
with you.
individualist. I just think that how happy you are in the society like Seoul or New York has to do with, are you really a libertarian deep inside, or are you someone who wants more to be taken care of?
Right.
And I think more New Yorkers want to be taken care of, and that's why they vote the way they vote.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Listen, we've been going for almost an hour and a half now, just about. So I think it's about time to wrap up, but very, very quickly. Back to what we were talking about just a little bit earlier. You were hanging out with Dennis Rodman. And for those of you who remember, there was a moment on TV when Dennis Rodman was over in North Korea where he was wearing a MAGA hat, and this made news headlines.
Oh, that was in Singapore.
Oh, was this in Singapore? Am I misremembering?
Yeah,
fake
Dennis.
news.
Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, I gave you guys misinformation. I'm sorry.
Dennis and I went to Singapore for the Trump Kim summit.
Okay.
And so first thing in the morning of when Trump was meeting Kim, we were at CNN. They had a post there doing interviews. And so we were going into an interview with Chris Cuomo. And Chris Cuomo, by the way, was when we were in North Korea, did this interview of Dennis that was just terrible. I mean, it really caused a lot of problems for Dennis. And so there was not a lot of love between those guys at that point. But then Chris Cuomo in that interview said, I admit it, you were right. I was wrong. You were the clairvoyant. You're the only one that got it right about Kim Jong-un and Trump and all this stuff. And I couldn't believe he said it. It's a great interview if you ever see it on CNN for us. But right before he went out there, knowing Chris Cuomo, and we were there because Dennis is Trump's friend, I brought a MAGA hat with me. And I gave it to him, and he wore it to the interview. And so he's got this hat on, and he's outside on the balcony, and Chris Cuomo is like 50 feet away from him, so he couldn't really see where he was doing the interview from. He goes, "What does your hat say?" And Dennis is looking at him like, "What do you make America great again?" And he's like, "Oh." And he didn't know what to say at that point. It was hilarious.
That's one of my favorites, man. I love that story. That's so funny. When you told me that, because I remember seeing it in the news, and then you were like, "Yeah, that was my hat."
Yeah, I gave it to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea," because we were there supporting Trump. So, and Trump had Sarah Sanders called us in the hotel on behalf of Trump to thank us and everything.
That is too
Well,
good.
Joe, I really
saw the
appreciate
North
you coming
Koreans there
on.
because we stayed across the street from where Kim was staying, and we went over there and hung out with some of our friends in the evening in the bar before he
Of
met
course
Trump.
you did. Oh my God. Those guys like to drink. To the North Korean guys really like to throw them back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They sell, like, I have a picture somewhere, like they sell soju. Soju is Korean liquor, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's like wine 20% normally, but in North Korea it's like 35%. It's much stronger. And they sold this like 4-gallon jug for like $1 that I had in a plastic bottle. It was hilarious.
Oh man.
So they also have good beer, unlike South Korea. They have really good craft beers, dark beers, and things. So they bought factories from England, and they brought the entire factory to North Korea.
Wow.
Very interesting.
That isn't it. That's a interesting fact. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I just wish I could go back. I wish our authoritarian government would change this law that denies us the right to go there as American citizens. I had an exchange program funded by Columbia between Columbia and Kim Il-sung University in North Korea. In 2017, we got the award, and we were going to do faculty exchanges and eventual student exchanges between Columbia and the biggest university in North Korea.
Wow.
And I negotiated all that with the North Korean university. And then Trump banned travel by Americans, and they refused to give us special passports, saying this is not in the interest of the United States. So it all ended like that. And so right now, our government is the biggest obstacle, because although I must say, last week, the university I taught at in North Korea reopened with faculty in person. They were the first Westerners given resident visas in North Korea, were people from Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, not Americans, but Europeans. And so we're just hoping that at some point our government stops seeing everything you do that gives them something as a reward. It's sort of like, when I think we're over there, we're teaching them that Americans are nice people. We're teaching them that you can get along with us, and that we're the same as you, and that we respect you and you respect us. And that's how you change things. And especially since the kids that go to our university are all elite. And the elites are the most important people to influence. You want them to know that we're not trying to kill them. We want them to have a positive view of Americans and the ability to build partnerships and relationships based on trust. Because the biggest problem in international relations between the US and North Korea is nobody trusts each other.
Yeah.
You know why we don't trust them, and they don't trust us, because the peace treaty for the Korean War, we said no nuclear weapons in South Korea or the Korean Peninsula, and then we put them in 2 years later. We constantly make deals with them and break them, and we do this with every country, and we wonder why we can't make deals with people, why nobody trusts us. It's like, Clinton made a deal on giving them light water reactors in exchange for shutting down the main nuclear reactor, and we were going to give them fuel oil. Bush slow-walked it and basically killed it. Then Bush, it's like he made the deal with Gaddafi that, you give up your nuclear weapons and we give you security guarantees, and then Obama killed Gaddafi, right? Then Obama made the JCPOA with Iran, and then Trump killed the JCPOA. Trump started building relations with North Korea, and Biden shut that down. It's like we do this all the time. So we keep saying we want from them complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, but nothing we give them is complete, verifiable, and irreversible.
So a lot of instability from us.
Yeah. And they always say, we're always the same. So if we don't like your policy, we just wait 4 years.
Wow.
Because we don't change, and you change all the time, and you don't keep your word. And when we brought the basketball team to North Korea in 2014, Kim Jong-un said to me, he goes, you're the first American that kept his word.
Wow.
And I think that's important. And I think having these relationships where we have a university, or we do science projects, or we do music exchange, things that aren't affecting anything politically or militarily, these are the ways that you build this sort of trust and can build relationships and learn that people are all the same, and that we're all a little bit brainwashed by our systems. And yet we can still get along with each other as human beings if we show human respect and treat them like human beings. And we're not treating them like human beings.
And this is why we need to have a part 2 with you about how that relates to a more micro level at our university campus in America. Yeah. We should do a part 2 on this.
There was a ton that we wanted to talk about that we didn't get to. I wanted to ask you
do it again.
About inbreeding, about like 10 other stories you've told us, way more about genetics. So we'll definitely have to have a part 2.
You know, I mean, come on, we see each other every week. We all together at Heterodox Academy. And for those of you who aren't members, you should join, because what we want is a place where people are happy to be wrong. I'm very happy when I'm wrong. I'm more happy when I'm wrong than when I'm right, because if somebody shows me that I'm wrong and I go back home, think about it, and realize I'm wrong, I learned something. And the way you learn something is by talking to people you disagree with. And so we like to disagree with each other. And I wish more people were coming to our Heterodox Academy meetings who disagreed with us, because it's become a group of people who kind of agree about stuff, and it's almost like defeating the purpose. So come, if you disagree with me, come meet with us. Tell me I'm full of shit. You know, my rule when I had graduate students was, you're not ready to get a PhD till you tell me I'm full of shit and you're right about it. And that's my philosophy about everything when it comes to students. Challenge your professors, challenge us, but be willing to be wrong. Yeah. And if you're wrong, go home, think about it, and come back. And if you still think that you're wrong, if you realize you're wrong later, come say, you know, you're right. I changed my opinion. And I do that all the time. I won't change my opinion in the argument. I'll change it later after I think about what you said, if you make a good point. So make a good point, be friendly, and talk to people. And that's how we get past all these problems in our society as well as international relations.
I think that's a great moral and a great lesson to end on. You heard it here, folks. If you want to make Joe happy, tell him he's full of shit, but come prepared. You best come correct.
Yeah, and come every other Thursday to our drinking parties and tell me over beer that I'm wrong, and I'm even more nice over beer.
Oh, yeah. Every other Thursday at the Lion's Head at 7 p.m.
That's right. Yeah. So, and that would be, well, I don't know.
Thursday, starting this Thursday.
This Thursday. Okay,
we're doing this Thursday. We're going to be at the Lion's Head. On 1/10. All right, everyone.
109, I think.
Is it 109? Is it somewhere? It's the Lion's Head in that area. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. Joe, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
It was so much fun. We're going to have you back on. You have so many more cool stories. And
you wish you knew.
We will see you in the next one. I got to go because I have a wedding to prepare for. I'm in Michigan right now. And I got to go to a dinner. So I will see you all later.
Okay.
Enjoy. And
bye-bye.